In August 1942, the Imperial Japanese Army met an enemy unlike any it had faced before. The United States Marine Corps landed on Guadalcanal, a small island in the Solomon chain that most Japanese soldiers had never heard of. The objective seemed minor, an unfinished Japanese airfield, but it marked the start of a campaign that would transform the Japanese perception of the American fighting man. At first, Tokyo dismissed the landing as a temporary nuisance. Japan had conquered half of Asia in less than a year, defeating Western armies from Singapore to the Philippines. The Americans, the Japanese believed, were soft, industrial men dependent on machines, incapable of enduring hardship without supplies or comfort. The emperor's soldiers, raised in a culture of sacrifice and obedience, had been told that their spirit, the Yamato Damashi, made them invincible. Then came the Marines. At Henderson Field, under blazing heat and constant bombardment, the 1st Marine Division dug in. They had landed short on food, ammunition, and medicine. They fought malaria, rain, mud, and starvation. Yet they refused to break. In the first major ground battle of the Pacific War, the Battle of the Tenaru River, Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki's elite detachment charged the Marine lines in the darkness, expecting the Americans to flee. They didn't. The Marines waited with interlocking machine guns, flares, and mortars. When Ichiki's men reached the wire, they were cut down by disciplined, controlled fire, the kind of organized violence the Japanese were unused to meeting in jungle warfare. At dawn, the beach was covered in bodies. Ichiki committed ritual suicide beside the ruins of his command. From that night on, Japanese reports began to change. They described the Marines as stubborn devils, men who fought even when wounded, who counterattacked without orders, who did not retreat when surrounded. The myth of the soft American was shattered on Guadalcanal's black sand. But what truly frightened Japanese commanders was the Marines' adaptability. When artillery fire failed to drive them out, they dug deeper. When supplies ran short, they fought with captured weapons. They moved through jungle and swamp with a hunter's patience, ambushing at close range and vanishing into the trees. Japanese officers later noted that the Marines' discipline, their refusal to panic, reminded them of their own elite units. The Marines were learning fast, too. Veterans of the old China detachments and Nicaragua campaigns passed jungle fighting lessons to green recruits. Their commanders, men like General Alexander Vandergrift and Colonel Merritt Edson, led from the front. On the ridge that now bears Edson's name, Marines held against a screaming banzai assault by 3 Japanese battalions. When the fighting stopped, the ridge was carpeted with bodies. The Japanese 35th Brigade ceased to exist. For the first time in the war, the Imperial Japanese Army had met a Western force that matched its fanaticism with endurance and surpassed it with firepower and coordination. After months of fighting, Japan evacuated Guadalcanal. It was the first major land defeat in the empire's modern history. The diaries of surviving Japanese soldiers from the Solomons show a recurring theme: confusion, disbelief, and grudging respect. One lieutenant wrote, "They fight as demons. They do not fear death, and they do not tire." Guadalcanal was the moment the Japanese army learned the name U.S. Marine Corps and began to fear it. By late 1943, the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy had learned to dread a specific kind of assault, one that came from the sea, preceded by thunder, and ended with the same grim rhythm. Waves of U.S. Marines advancing yard by yard until every gun on the island went silent. The next test of that reputation came at a name most Americans could barely pronounce: Betio Island, part of the Tarawa Atoll in the Gilbert Islands. The Butcher's Test, Tarawa. Betio was tiny, less than 3 miles long, but defended by nearly 4,800 Japanese troops, dug into bunkers, pillboxes, and trenches built from coral and concrete. Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki, the island's commander, boasted, "1 million men cannot take Tarawa in 100 years. The Marines did it in 76 hours." On November 20th, 1943, after an immense naval bombardment, the 2nd Marine Division went ashore in the first full-scale amphibious assault of the Pacific War. But the tide betrayed them. Higgins' boats grounded on reefs hundreds of yards from shore, forcing Marines to wade through waist-deep water under machine gun fire. Entire platoons were cut down before reaching the beach. Japanese gunners, shielded in their bunkers, fired until their barrels melted. Yet the Marines did not break. They crawled forward through surf and blood, using rifles held above the water, bayonets fixed. When they reached land, they attacked the pillboxes one by one, grenades through firing slits, flamethrowers clearing tunnels, satchel charges turning strong points into rubble. Japanese officers watching from the rear saw something few had expected. Americans who fought hand-to-hand without hesitation, who would crawl into a bunker with a knife rather than retreat. When night fell, the surviving defenders heard a sound that haunted Japanese diaries for the rest of the war. Marines singing and laughing as they resupplied, as if nothing could shake their nerve. The next morning they came again, sweeping through trenches in coordinated squads, with engineers, machine gunners, and tank crews working in perfect rhythm. By the 3rd day, organized resistance had ceased. Of the 4,800 Japanese troops, only 17 survived. The Japanese were stunned. Shibasaki's boast had become an epitaph. A Tokyo radio broadcast admitted the defeat, but tried to save face. The enemy fought with great bravery and exceeded our expectations. In private, Japanese officers were less formal. They described the Marines as amphibious demons, soldiers who emerged from fire and refused to die. If Tarawa proved what the Marines could do, Saipan proved what they could endure. In June 1944, more than 70,000 Marines and soldiers landed on the island, the first Japanese territory to be invaded. Here, the defenders knew there would be no evacuation, no reinforcement, and no retreat. The Emperor's line had to hold. The Marines faced fortified cliffs, caves, and ravines, defended by nearly 30,000 Japanese troops and civilians prepared to fight to the death. For 25 days, the island became a nightmare of close combat. Entire companies vanished in hours. The heat and stench of decaying bodies were constant. When Japanese tanks counterattacked near Tanapag, the Marines met them head-on with bazookas and grenades, fighting so close that tank hatches were blown off by hand-thrown explosives. The Japanese soldiers expected the Americans to hesitate when faced with such ferocity. Instead, they saw a reflection of themselves, disciplined, relentless, and utterly unafraid of casualties. A captured officer wrote that the Marines attacked as though they could not feel fear. On July 7, 1944, the Japanese launched one of the largest banzai charges of the entire Pacific War, over 3,000 men in a screaming rush at dawn. For hours, the Marines of the 8th Regiment fought hand-to-hand, using bayonets, entrenching tools, and even fists. When the sun rose higher, the field was covered in corpses. The last organized Japanese assault in the Central Pacific had been annihilated. After Saipan, Japanese morale began to fracture. The Army's own reports described the enemy as impossible to break. Many soldiers no longer believed they could win, even in death. A captured diary found on Saipan read, "They come from the sea like ghosts. When one falls, another appears. They are not men, they are a storm." To the Japanese High Command, the meaning was clear. The Marines could not be stopped on the beaches. Every island lost brought the war closer to Japan itself. and there were no defences left that could match this kind of determination. By early 1945, the Imperial Japanese Army no longer underestimated the US Marines. They feared them. The names of Tarawa and Saipan had already entered Japanese military lore as lessons in what happened when Marines came ashore. Now, as the American advance closed in on the Japanese homeland itself, every soldier on every island expected annihilation. 2 battles, Iwo Jima and Okinawa, would turn that fear into something deeper: resignation. Iwo Jima was a volcanic rock halfway between the Marianas and Japan, an island so small it barely appeared on most maps, but its airfields were vital. Japan's interceptors could launch from there. America's B-29 bombers needed it as a safe haven on their long return from Tokyo. For both nations, it was sacred ground before a single bullet was fired. Defending it were 21,000 Japanese soldiers under General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, a commander unlike any other. He had studied in the United States before the war, he understood American psychology, and especially he understood the Marines. Kuribayashi knew that the traditional Japanese tactic of mass suicide charges would fail. The Marines thrived under pressure. They didn't panic. So he changed the rules. He ordered his men to dig a city beneath the island, 11 miles of tunnels, bunkers, and artillery chambers carved into volcanic stone. There would be no defense on the beaches, no visible front line. Every inch would be contested from underground. "We will kill 10 of the enemy for every one of us," Kuribayashi wrote, "and die willingly." On February 19, 1945, when the Marines of the 4th and 5th Divisions stormed the black sand beaches, the island looked silent. Then the mountain erupted. Hidden guns opened up from the cliffs, crossfire cutting down entire platoons. Tanks sank in the ash-like sand, bogged and burning. Waves of wounded clogged the beaches. But again, as at Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Saipan, the Marines did not retreat. They clawed forward inch by inch, turning every crater into a strong point, every corpse into cover. Naval bombardment turned the island to smoke. When it cleared, the Marines were still there. The Japanese defenders soon learned the worst truth of all. The Marines never stopped coming. They attacked at night, advanced through rain and flame, and cleared tunnels one by one with flamethrowers and satchel charges. The smell of burning sulfur and flesh was constant. Casualties were staggering, 26,000 Marines killed or wounded, but they kept moving. Kuribayashi himself wrote to Tokyo, "The enemy's courage and tenacity are beyond belief. They do not fear death, they fight as if already dead." After 36 days of combat, the mountain fortress of Suribachi fell. When the flag went up on February 23rd, the photograph would become immortal. But for the Japanese survivors trapped in tunnels, it was the sound of a world ending. Kuribayashi refused to surrender. Most of his men fought until they were buried alive or burned in their bunkers. Only 216 of 21,000 lived to be captured. To Japan, Iwo Jima was a warning and a prophecy. If the Marines could take that island, there was nothing left between them and home. The final nightmare came 2 months later. Okinawa, the largest island in the Ryukyu chain, was the last barrier before Japan itself. The Japanese High Command threw everything into its defense. Over 100,000 troops, fortified ridges, artillery concealed in caves, and a plan to bleed the Americans so brutally that they might sue for peace. When the Marines and Army troops of 10th Army landed on April 1, 1945, the initial days seemed eerily calm. The Japanese had learned from Iwo Jima. They held their fire. Then the storm broke. From Shuri Ridge to Sugarloaf Hill, Marines fought in torrential rain, knee-deep mud and choking smoke. Entire hills changed hands multiple times a day. The Japanese turned every cave into a trap and every corpse into bait. Marines advanced by inches, often fighting hand-to-hand in the dark. Flamethrowers roared into tunnels until the very stone caught fire. Japanese soldiers noted with horror that the Marines refused to stop fighting, even under unbearable losses. The 6th Marine Division at Sugarloaf suffered over 50% casualties, yet took the hill. The psychological toll was devastating. Japanese diaries speak of hearing American flamethrowers in the night and writing farewell notes before dawn. Meanwhile, Japanese commanders began to realize something their ideology could not explain. The Marines' discipline matched their own fanaticism, but it was driven by purpose, not death worship. The Americans fought to survive, not to die, and that made them even more dangerous. They didn't retreat, they didn't panic, and they didn't stop until every enemy position was gone. By the time Okinawa fell in June, over 100,000 Japanese soldiers and 12,000 Americans lay dead. Civilians by the tens of thousands had perished. But to Japanese officers watching from Kyushu, one fact stood above all. The Marines had endured hell and kept moving forward. An Imperial Army report sent to Tokyo after Okinawa concluded grimly, "They are not men. They are a species evolved for war. Against such an enemy, victory is no longer possible." From that moment on, the Japanese military knew the invasion of their homeland would be apocalyptic. The word Marine was now synonymous with unstoppable destruction, the storm that no defense could withstand. By the summer of 1945, the word Marine had become something closer to a curse among Japan's soldiers and civilians alike, whispered in reports, scrawled in diaries, and repeated in terrified rumor from Okinawa to the home islands. The Imperial Japanese Army, once confident in its spiritual superiority, now faced an adversary whose endurance defied explanation. They had fought the British at Singapore, the Dutch in Java, the Chinese for years, and the Russians before the war, but none had shaken them like the United States Marine Corps. In the ruins of Okinawa, captured diaries and field notes began to tell the same story. One Japanese sergeant wrote, "They fight like machines, but with the eyes of beasts. They keep coming. They do not stop." Officers reported that morale collapsed not when Marines attacked, but when soldiers knew the Marines were landing nearby. A psychological bulletin sent to Tokyo by the 32nd Army summarized the new enemy with chilling clarity. "The Marines are the most terrifying of all American forces. They are trained for death. They do not retreat. Their fire never ceases. They will come even when surrounded by flame." Japanese soldiers coined grim nicknames, kaibutsu, monsters, and ningen oni, human demons. Many began to believe that the Marines were drugged or possessed. Imperial Army medics tried to explain it as adrenaline, but most troops saw something supernatural in their relentlessness. The fear reached even elite formations. At Kyushu, where Japan expected the next invasion, intelligence briefings warned that the enemy's vanguard would likely be Marine divisions. One officer told his men, "If you hear their shouting, know you will not live to see morning." Even among Japan's high command, there was recognition that something set the Marines apart from the US Army or Navy landing forces. Japanese reports after Saipan and Iwo Jima described them as shock troops designed for impossible missions, the first to land, the last to leave, fighting without rest until the enemy was annihilated. The Marines' combat doctrine explained part of it: small unit initiative, precision coordination between infantry, armor, and air support, and relentless offensive action. But to the Japanese, who valued ritual obedience, the Marines' independence, their willingness to improvise under fire, was frightening. They seemed immune to confusion. Even leaderless, they advanced. Captured Japanese officers also noted the Marines' treatment of their wounded, that men crawled into gunfire to drag comrades out, even under shelling. To an enemy raised in a system that glorified dying for the emperor, this loyalty was alien. They fight for each other, not for their generals, one colonel wrote. That is their strength. By mid-1945, Japan's defense ministry conducted a classified assessment of the war's last year. It concluded that the psychological impact of the marine landings had been catastrophic. On islands like Saipan and Iwo Jima, where most defenders fought to the death, Japanese intelligence estimated that up to 40% of combat fatalities occurred after morale collapse. Soldiers committing suicide, detonating grenades, or charging blindly when faced with marine encirclement. These reports never reached the public, but among field officers the lesson was clear. The Marines could not be stopped through fear because they were fear. The Japanese propagandists who once mocked American decadence now issued warnings to civilians about inhumanly persistent US forces. Leaflets distributed to island garrisons before the expected invasion of Japan described the Marines as the most terrible among the enemy's soldiers. One even claimed they were raised from birth to kill. It was meant to steel Japanese resolve, but it only deepened dread. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, many of its officers expressed relief not only at the emperor's decision, but at being spared from facing the Marine divisions poised for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Kyushu. American occupation officials later found memos describing how entire Japanese units had rehearsed final counterattacks designed to die before contact, not because of honor, but because they could not face another battle like Iwo Jima. In the post-war years, interviews with surviving Japanese soldiers confirmed what Allied reports had already shown. The US Marines had replaced fear of death with fear of defeat. Even veteran samurai-descended officers admitted that the Marines' endurance, their refusal to surrender, their tactical mastery, their terrifying cohesion, had permanently changed their view of the American soldier. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi's last letter, written before his death on Iwo Jima, summed it up best. The enemy we face now is not the soft American of our propaganda. He is strong, enduring, and unyielding. If all his countrymen fight as he does, Japan will lose this war. Kuribayashi was right. From the black sands of Iwo Jima to the ridges of Okinawa, the Marines proved that fear was a weapon that cut both ways, and that in the Pacific it no longer belonged to Japan. When Japan rebuilt after the war, its new military textbooks described the US Marine Corps as an example of total commitment in modern warfare. To the men who fought them, the Marines were not simply enemies. They were the storm that never stopped coming.